Good afternoon. Thank you and welcome to our final event for the 2019 Australian Gender Economics Workshop. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting here today, the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and can we please pay our respects and acknowledge their ancestors and elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors for this wonderful policy symposium this afternoon, the RMIT Social Change Enabling Capability Program. I do not have a great deal of detail around that program, but it sounds absolutely fantastic. My name is Rebecca Castles and I'm an Associate Professor at the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and I'm also part of the organising committee for this wonderful workshop. So how can economics contribute to the pursuit of gender equity? Well, if economics has taught us anything over the past couple of days, it most certainly has taught us just how good it is at shining a light on some of the most pressing gender equity issues of our time, including how much of a gender equity problem it has within its own discipline, as highlighted so well by our keynote speaker yesterday, Professor Shelley Lumberg. We've also seen how an economic approach or an economic lens to so many problems can help us understand these better and really importantly, help us to solve them. Whether there is a systematic devaluation of care workers, how women and men behave in different competitive environments and the impact on productivity, what the drivers of the gender pay gap are and how we can address these, whether there are gender differences in prices of Australian Indigenous art, and as our keynote speaker this morning, Professor Iris Bonnet pointed out so well, how we can actually move from intention to action when looking to progress gender equality in our workplaces. And we have a wonderful panel here this afternoon that will help us to continue to think about how economics can practically contribute to the pursuit of gender equity in our lives. The Honourable Dr. Andrew Leigh, welcome. Andrew is also the Shadow Assistant Treasurer and Federal Member of Fenner, which is also my electorate in Canberra. Andrew also, prior to this position that he's held since 2010, was a Professor of Economics, and I think he is very well known in the profession at ANU and holds a PhD from Harvard. And Andrew is also a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences here in Australia and a past recipient of the Young Economists Award. Andrew's also written many books, including one on randomisation control trials, and he's really a big fan of that, and I expect to hear quite a lot about the RCTs and what they can do for gender equity today. Trish Bergin, welcome. Trish is the head of the Office for Women at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the First Assistant Secretary, and she has held senior leadership roles across public, private and community sectors. Trish has a degree in economics as well from ANU and has been a champion of women's progression in the workforce and leads the goals of the Office for Women, which are to strengthen women's economic security, an incredibly important goal, to support more women in leadership, another incredibly important goal, and to ensure that women and their children are safe from violence, something that we all want to see changed in our society. Chief Executive Officer of the Diversity Council of Australia, Annese, welcome. Lisa leads debate on diversity and inclusion in the public arena and provides innovative resources to Australian businesses to improve their inclusion policies. Lisa has an absolute wealth of experience in this space and just last year was named in the Fin Review's 100 Women of Influence. Professor Helen Hodgson from Curtin University and the National Foundation for Australian Women. Welcome, Helen. Helen is a Professor of Tax Law at Curtin Law School and an absolute expert in the taxation, transfer and superannuation systems, and also focuses a lot of her attention on how these systems impact upon women. Helen also holds several senior positions on boards and committees and is Director of Social Policy Committee of the National Foundation of Australian Women. And to moderate these discussions, we have Dr. Leonora, Risse, Chair of the Women in Economics Network Victoria Branch, and RMIT Vice-Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow. Leonora is a champion of women in economics and is a real driving force behind many of the WEN initiatives, including this wonderful focus, the Australian Gender Economics Workshop. Welcome, everyone, and I really look forward to this afternoon's discussion. Thank you.
Can I just say, we had the idea to run a gender economics workshop with a panel with policy, government, economists, researchers, we had some ideas, we had some names of people we would like to involve. And what we ended up with was my dream panel. So thank you for being here. I couldn't think of a better collection of shared wisdom and experience and insight and expertise. So thank you. Now, gender equality events. It's a good thing that we are witnessing more of these panels, symposiums, discussions. What's unique about this event is that we have an audience full of economists and policy practitioners who have the tools at their disposal to contribute to this research base and to advance our knowledge. They're not just passionate, but they can be involved. So one of the outcomes of this policy symposium, ideally, is for you to leave with a greater sense of knowledge and direction as to what you are going to do in your own research agendas and in your own workspaces. Now, when we talk about gender inequality, we know the stats, they're dismal. I started writing a few, but the list just goes on and on. We know we've got the pay gap, corporate representation, statistics which are really coming to the fore regarding domestic violence and safety, attitudinal information. Hilda survey data informs us that 22% of Australians believe it is better if the man earns the money and the woman takes care of the children. So we could go on with those stats. What we also have, it's being generated by researchers here, are evidence of solutions and strategies and programs that can work to intervene and make a difference, such as encouraging pay equity auditing, behavioural nudges, the effects of quotas. And we also have the capacity here to calibrate the monetary fallout and the fallout on wellbeing. So we're preaching to the converted here, right? So we know the stats, we know the solutions. We need to get that message out. So my question to you is, are we doing a good enough job of communicating the importance of gender diversity and gender inclusion to the people who need to hear it? I'll start with you, Lisa, because you interact very closely with businesses. They're hands-on in this space.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. Look, I think the audience that I am often talking to are, the top sort of 600 employers in Australia, lots of big corporates and lots of multinationals that operate in Australia, government departments, universities, and they join DCA because they're committed to diversity and inclusion. If I cast my mind back to when I first started working in this type of profession over 20 years ago, it really was government agencies who were leading the way. And I feel as though the corporate sector has now really gets why gender equality is important. It's not to say they get it for the right reasons, and it's not to say that they all get it and that there's not backlash and resistance within it. But I rarely get pushback from corporates around this agenda, and I'm out there all the time speaking to CEOs and senior managers. They understand that gender equality is good for business, that it's part of their corporate social responsibility, and even if their heart's not in the right place, they certainly understand the business case. So I feel like for the most part, the corporate sector is listening, not uniformly. What concerns me is what's happening more broadly, that there seems to be this public debate at the moment around, you can't even cast your mind back to the new year when the Gillette ad came out, and didn't people lose their minds over that ad, sort of demonstrating how important it was for men to role model really good, respectful behaviour. And something that I think most reasonable people should look at and think, well, that's in the interests of the public. We know the statistics around domestic and family violence show that the majority of victims are female, the majority of perpetrators are men, and yet the culture, as has been coined by some commentators, the culture wars were right out there. And that really is what concerns me, in that all the pushback that is happening as though Western civilization is under threat, which is completely blown out of proportion. So I would say that with the audience that I deal with organisations, you can have a really rational discussion, even if they're not always with you, and even if you've got a long way to go. But more broadly, there's something happening, and it's not just in Australia, it's global, a backlash against equity, a complete denial of evidence, as though Me Too is not a real thing, or as though violence against women is not a real thing, when we know it's a real thing. So that's really what worries me. So I think in terms of the conversation, I think that we'll continue to work with evidence-based research and continue to try and change hearts and minds. But I think that some operators in the media and some operators in the political sphere are not interested in evidence and are interested in fear, and that concerns me.
Thank you, Lisa. So that's interesting to think about the corporate world being perhaps a bit removed from the rest of society and the other, the everyday person, perhaps. Trish, can I turn to you and ask the same sort of question, but thinking about in government? And I'm thinking back to Senate estimates a few months ago, where a certain independent senator actually asked you, look, we've got an office for women, but why don't we have an office for men? And Senator Risse Waters replied, well, we do, it's called Parliament. So you actually have within government these gender equality deniers, and Lisa coined the phrase earlier on, there's like climate change skeptics or climate change deniers who just are resistant to acknowledging there's a problem. How do we communicate to them? Or do we even try?
Thank you. And yes, that was a very special moment for me at Senate Estimates, I have to say. And we have another Senate Estimates coming up next Monday evening, about 6 o'clock. So I'm sure there may be something similar. In terms of that as an issue, though, I think you're right. I think there certainly there's an issue there around continuing to have the evidence, and I think what was important in responding, particularly in that situation, being asked about the Office for Men, and I eventually said, of course, we would work with an Office for Men. We work across government to include all interests, because our objective is actually about gender equality, and I think that kind of shut down the argument a bit, because it is really about, that's really what we're working towards. And in some cases, such as in the situation of looking at men's participation in the home and certainly in their role as parents, that's a big policy agenda, I think, that needs to have the data and the evidence collected to really demonstrate the far-reaching effects that would have in terms of nudging the dial on cultural norms and stereotypes across society. So it is something that we're very, very keen on. More broadly, though, I think it hasn't been, for whatever reason, I think in government there has been a very strong focus on, fiscal restraint, all of those sorts of things, and a very economically rational view of policy making. So one of the things that when I came into the office and I looked around at the sort of skills and the approach that we were taking, and it wasn't a very data evidence-based approach. So one of the first things that we did early last year was to really look at, really overhaul our complete kind of operating model, if you like, and recognise that we had some significant gaps around economic skills, data and analytics, presentation of data, and the ability to make a really strong case for gender equality. And one of the things that I often say to people is that we have to have the data, but we've also got to have the story. So my favourite saying that people get sick of me saying is no data without stories, and no stories without data, because you really have to have that whole. To me, that is the head and heart. And so we've really pushed that, because when push comes to shove in cabinet or in Senate estimates, if you don't have that, it's very easy for people to just say, well, I don't know how big an issue is that? How important is it? What's the economic cost of that? How many people are impacted by that? We've got to have those numbers and those answers. And so really taking quite a very strong analytical lens to what is a social issue is important to have it counted in the room in terms of policy choices. When government's making choices about where to put its dollars, we need to have that. So I think we're starting down that path. I don't think within government, I think there's been, and we'll probably talk about this a bit later, but the whole data story is one that really needs a lot more in terms of collection of data at a disaggregated level. I mean, we had a fantastic presentation this afternoon about disaggregated data by occupation and by industry. And again, the devil is in the detail. You can look at general sort of descriptions and say, well, there's no gender impact here or something, but it's not until you actually break it down further that you start to see there is, it's extremely gendered. So I think the more that we continue to do that, the better, but there's a way to go.
Thank you, Trish. I think there is this agreement that data and evidence is weaponry, if you like. We need to collect it. We also need to communicate it. Andrew, speaking as a member of Parliament and in a former life as an economist, hopefully there's still a bit of economist in you still. So the same question applies. Are economists, even if we're gathering this evidence and this data, are we communicating it in terms that express the society-wide impacts of gender diversity? It's not just restrained to the individual, it's actually a public externality problem in a way. Are we communicating that properly, and are economists actually analysing it in that framework?
Thanks, Leonora, and thanks for letting me be the token bloke on the panel. I will do my best to avoid mansplaining over the course of the next hour and a half. I think economists are collecting a lot of really important data, and I think particularly around gender pay gap, the work that's been done in Australia is some of the most interesting that I've seen, looking at this being more an issue of glass ceilings than sticky floors, trying to decompose the role of industry, discrimination, sexual harassment, and then a set of other sort of parallel studies that hint at community attitudes. One of the most shocking to me is a study which surveys pocket money and finds that there is a gender pocket money gap. Boys get more pocket money than girls of the same age. And then when you're on the expenditure side, the work that New York City has done on the pink tax, suggesting that similar products are priced higher when it's a woman's product than a man's product. And I think the way to communicate this is to step away from that notion that Art Oken had, that there's always an equity efficiency trade-off, and to make clear that this is both an issue of equity and efficiency, that a workplace which allows greater diversity is a more effective workplace. Homogenous boards are more likely to make bad decisions. Homogenous workplaces are likely to get stuck in groupthink. But also that flexibility, by which I mean flexibility of workers to combine work and family rather than flexibility of bosses to schedule workers anytime they want. That sort of flexibility actually is incredibly valuable for society as a whole. It might well allow people whose kids have left home to work 4 days a week and to combine fishing or looking after grandkids or travelling the world with work, and that's actually a much healthier relationship for our society to have with work. But it requires working out how you can chunk up jobs in a way that, as Claudia Golden argues, pharmacy has done really well and law has done really badly. So using IT to split jobs, I think, is a huge way forward for gender equity, and we'll get much further at it if we say this isn't just about closing the gender pay gap, this is also about boosting the growth rate.
Yeah, so conceptualising gender equity as an ingredient for well-being, I guess, at the end of the day.
Precisely.
Helen, since we mentioned tax, I have a quote here from our current Prime Minister when he was Treasurer. He said, "We don't fill out a pink form or a blue form when we do our taxes, so there's no such thing as gender inequity in the tax and transfer system." Okay, so it's true. That's true. I don't have a pink form, but there's more to it than that, as we know. And we had our gender lensing masterclass on the first day of this workshop, which was about opening up people's awareness to the fact that across the board, economic policy and budgetary decisions affect men and women in different ways, not intentionally, but by virtue of the different lives that they're living. Can you share with us some of what you think are the most pressing examples of the incidental ways in which the tax and transfer system actually generates gender inequality?
Okay, so as far as the tax and transfer system goes, the main issue is when you start to look at the effects, and is Ben still in the room? All of his distributional analysis, the work that he does, he was saying in his presentation today that it's less the effective marginal tax rate because that's only a very small number of people. But what we find is that the pattern of women's lives means that they tend to cluster in the lower income sectors. So that means that whenever you're looking at the effect of tax cuts, whenever you're looking at the effect of withdrawal of benefits, it will impact on low-income earners more than on high-income earners because they're at the margins. So without the micro simulation modelling does a really good job of setting out some of this in a lot of detail. But the recent proposals to reduce taxes at the top end is going to go primarily to men because they earn more. And that's a function of the fact that women are juggling work and care. And so a lot of the decisions that are made come down to this systemic issue around women's caring roles. The fact that women are juggling work and care, they work less, they have lower paid jobs, and all of this effectively clusters them in the lower ranges of the tax system. So that, I think, is where the work needs to be done. And I do think that you can take this more broadly. When you look at issues like consumption taxes, the GST in Australia, it's probably not quite so bad in Australia because of the exemption of food. But you do find that in countries where it's a uniform GST on everything, a lot more of women's spending goes on basics like food. And so that means that they're also paying more GST in a lot of situations than men are because they're caring for a family, and so the family, they will tend to be responsible for household spending as opposed to individualised spending. Now, I'm not an economist. I take those sorts of data from what you guys provide me. You sort of have the data which says and shows where women's spending goes compared to men's spending. And then I run that through the tax and transfer system and through a policy lens, and I say, well, this is going to be the consequence if you change the tax setting in this way. It's not going to help women, or maybe it will help women, whichever way it goes.
These are really acute examples, so thank you. Let's move on to thinking about the mechanism or the framework that we can set up so that we can systematically conduct these types of analyses. And the National Foundation for Australian Women does that on a voluntary basis. Andrew, in your speech last year with the Women in Economics Network in Sydney, you made the point that you would be advocating for gender impact assessments on all new policies, working with governments to set and report on gender indicators across all portfolios. Now, Australia was once a leader in gender budget statements, and I have it on record here with historical work done by Marion Sawyer that Australia was once recognised by the UN as an example of best practice in gender budgeting. So originally I had a question written down, worded this way: what is stopping us from moving towards more gender lensing and gender mainstreaming in everyday policy making in Australia? And then I realised I need to reword that. Why did we do away with it in the first place? And how can we set up the system where if we do bring it back in place, it's not undone again? Trish, can I throw that question to you, please?
Sure. It's a really good question, and I think it's one that I think has two components. One is that the technical part of sort of why can't we do it? It's that we have the technology, if that makes sense. We have the experience of the 80s and 90s in terms of, as you say, the governance and the architecture, the tools and approaches. We've learned a lot from overseas. Canada in particular has really moved ahead, as we know, over the last 3 years in terms of their gender responsive budgeting and analysis of gender impact. So I think the technical side of how to do this is well known. It's the if you like the vexed question of why don't we? And I think that's an issue that comes forward. I think from my reading of history, and this goes to reading Marion's book and various other books, including Anne Summers, but certainly looking at why some of those things moved away. It was partly due to natural atrophy, if you like, within government. You know, there were these great impact statements. There were a lot of support for that in some sectors, and the government of the day for a long time was very supportive of using those statements as accountability documents to drive change and to really use that as a lens to look at policy. However, I think, you know, with a lot of once that intent or that leadership sort of shifts from that accountability for whatever reason, whether it's just, oh, you know, it's another thing we've got to do, or priorities shift, then once that accountability cycle is broken, then the tools are no longer as effective as they can be. So, as I say, it's a sort of a, you know, whether it's you know, that we have the tools, we know how we would do this, and I think it's about how it gets hardwired into the system with shared leadership across not just the political level, but absolutely at the bureaucratic level as well.
Andrew, how do we hardwire it into the system?
Well, Leonora, I think we're going to have to share his chair.
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right. We'll put that one down.
You were, I think, being quite generous when you talked about the statement having stopped. I mean, the history of the Women's Budget Statement, it starts in 1983. It's run by the Hawke, Keating, Howard, Rudd and Gillard governments, and then after 30 years, it's killed by the Abbott government. We'd reinstate it, and I think the reason that we would reinstate it is in some sense the flip side of why they killed it. It's the number of women in the room. So it's actually really stark to be, I don't know how many of you have come to the House of Reps recently. I wouldn't recommend this as a daily practice, but if you're there in the House now, it's really obvious the difference in the gender makeup on both sides. So our party room will be half women after the next election. In the House, the coalition are at 1 in 5. And that just shows up in everything. You can hear the difference, you can see the difference between the two sides, and obviously you notice the difference in terms of policy making. So we'll be doing the gender impact assessment of new policies. We'll be asking for firm level reporting on gender pay gaps. Chris Bowen has pointed to how odd it is that we have not had women running the Treasury, not had women running the Reserve Bank. No woman has ever headed the Productivity Commission, or ASIC, or APRA, and so on. And we'll change that. So making a difference in terms of the number of women in the room then flows through to a whole lot of policy outcomes. People just notice things they wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, I've had experiences of developing policies where I've gone to our Status of Women Policy Committee, presented the policy and gotten a whole lot of feedback. But unless you're in an environment in which that gender lens is encouraged, it just drops out.
Thank you. Helen, your response to that?
There was the comment that the gender budget or women's budget statements were continued until through the Gillard-Rudd, got to get that in the right order, years. But I think you find when you read the literature that there was an acknowledgement that from about the mid-90s they started to become less impactful. They were less data-based. They were more about statements of intent, more about policy statements rather than actually showing the effect. So I think that we really need to be careful and say what it is we're looking at. And we've got to get back to the data. We've got to get back to saying line by line. It's not just that this program is intended to assist women. It's that this program will assist women of this type in this way, and that the mainstream programs also need to be reported on. And I think that's what started to drop out in the that middle phase during the Howard-Rudd years. They became less line-by-line budget information and more about qualitative statements of intent. So I do think that, yes, we need to go back there, we need to go back there properly, but this is why, for those of you who were not at the Gender Masterclass on Wednesday, I mean, the approach that NFAW has taken is that we're outsiders looking in, and we can be impartial, and we can run a lens over it that will mean that we're actually looking at the effects, saying that this is what we expect the outcomes to be, and we can be an accountability measure to any form of formal budget, women's budget process. So there's definitely a role for both. There's a role for internal, government-led machinery of government gender budgeting, and there's a role for accountability measures to make sure that what is said is going to happen is actually what happens. So that's where we come from with the NFAW gender budget. It's our contribution to try to get the data out there. And to return to one of the issues that came up earlier, we actually engaged directly with policymakers on that level. We sent it out to all MPs of both sides of the House, even though it's only one side that tends to ask the questions in estimates based on what we find. We make submissions to inquiries regarding. I've just completed our submission on the early release of superannuation and got that one in today. We work at the policy level as well as then working with the grassroots. So I got a real buzz last year at the first AGEW workshop when somebody said to me, "Oh, that gender budget has helped me to keep my domestic violence policy group informed as to what's actually going on in the area." So we work at grassroots, we work at the top level, and we hope that somewhere what we're doing hits fertile ground.
You've identified a skill set that is so valuable that we need to keep investing in, and it's really encouraging to recognise that it's not just in-house, but it's outsiders looking in as well. And precisely that's where the DCA comes into effect too, Lisa, where you can be an outsider, analysing, commenting on policy directions, offering that independent point of view. Can you shed some light on what you think we should be focusing on, both in content and in skill set? What type of analyses do economists and policy practitioners need to be investing in to really answer the pressing questions?
Well, the work that we've done around the gender equality space has really revealed that there are, for working women and women who aren't able to participate fully, either through being underemployed or because their jobs are insecure or they're not able to break through in the market and get a job, that there's a couple of things. I mean, economic security around employment is really important, and there is quite a concerning trend against permanent employment, which predominantly affects women. So the high casualisation of the labour market, which has implications for women in terms of their earning capacity throughout their lifetime. The other thing that's really obvious to me when I look at how do you keep women employed at capacity in a way that's meaningful, and also men, is the idea of really trying to mainstream flexible working careers in workplaces across the country. I find this one particularly interesting because it doesn't matter who you speak to, everyone wants flexible work, especially younger people, millennials, but everybody does want more work, and it's not just because people have children, it's for all sorts of reasons. If you take a life cycle perspective of an individual throughout their whole employment, they might need flexibility for lots of different reasons, including childcare, but elder care, personal reasons, their own health and well-being, mental health issues. And so there's a real, and also operating alongside that has been this total revolution of the way we work through technology, and the fact that technology does enable people to always be at work, which is not necessarily a good thing. You actually never leave work now because there's an expectation that you're almost always available. So it seems to me that there's a lot of emphasis on using flexibility to always be available, but not necessarily the reverse. And I think that that's a real key enabler in terms of how to support lots of participation, more equitable participation, and also to ensure things like a reduction in the gender pay gap. And there's massive economic and social benefits around people being able to work in a way that's flexible. Now, it's like anything, flexibility so there's flexibility, there's the pay gap and participation in the workforce, but then also representation of people in positions of power. We need to have a more focused initiatives on making sure that happens. I think what Andrew said was really true. I mean, you do look at one side of politics, and they are. Some members of the Liberal Party, the Coalition, do talk openly about the fact that there are issues having women. How can you expect an organisation or a parliament to govern on behalf of everybody if not everyone's voices are at the table? I mean, it's self-evident. I mean, getting back to that question around having a gender lens on policy, well, a lot of that's about political willpower as well. If something's important to a particular individual or a government it doesn't matter whether you're in Parliament or you're running a corporation or you're just running your own family. If something's important, you will do it. So if it's not important to a certain group of people, well, maybe we have to change the mix so that there are more different types of people representing particular groups so that you can dot the I's and cross the T's.
There's several things going on here: flexible work, the use of technology, evaluation of care, balance between paid labour and unpaid labour, whatever you do with that unpaid time. So coming back to economics, we don't have optimal wellbeing indicators here. So something's wrong in the market, something's wrong with how economists are modelling this and conceptualising it. Andrew, would you like to comment on that? If you were back doing economics, would you be attracted to sort of dive into this space and sort of reconfigure how do we think about it? It's not just a neat line anymore. You can't, labour, leisure trade-off. It's so much more complicated, and we've got to think about women's overall lifetime participation. It's not static. How do we bring all these ideas together in a way that reconciles with reality?
Well, I think obviously this workshop is the number one answer to that, and boosting the way in which you're engaging with scholars and about the excitement in these topics. My sense is that these aren't just substantively important topics for economics journals, but that there is a huge appetite in the public for good gender-based analysis. And it needn't be terribly complicated. Betsy Stevenson had a lovely paper where she just went through the introductory economics textbooks and she just asked the question of those who are named in the textbooks, what share are men and what share are women? And so she looks at economists, she looks at celebrities, she looks at business leaders, and she finds right across the board 77% male, 18% women, and a few others unidentified gender. But essentially, for every woman in an introductory economics textbook, you've got 3 blokes. And that kind of analysis is opening people's eyes to the role of implicit bias within the economics profession. I think a harder question for economists is the extent to which the style of our discourse is discouraging women from entering economics. So I was just looking at Year 12 two-unit economics statistics last night, 2 men for every woman. And if you look at particular fields like finance and macro, this is a serious challenge. I really loved the seminar, the way in which the seminar culture didn't put an over hierarchical approach in the room. There was a real focus on getting to the truth of what was being analysed. But sometimes that crosses the line into unnecessary aggression, whether it's in the seminar room or whether it's in anonymous referee reports. And if that's one of the factors that's causing us to be an overly male-dominated profession, then yeah, we need to be introspective as well as making sure we're reshaping the wider world.
You segued into the next topic, which all politicians do so well. So I know what you want to talk about. Now, this is a really, really important topic. So we're talking about gender inequality across society and how we need to facilitate it so that we have more robust outcomes and better outcomes and better performance within corporations and organisations. But then looking at the economics profession, we've seen over the last 2 days with Professor Shelley Lundberg and Professor Iris Bonnet talking this morning, the biases and the barriers within the economics profession itself. And the takeaway from that is that we can't be optimising the outputs from the profession because there are all these distortions in place. And it's compromising the comprehensiveness of the issues that we choose to address. It's compromising the robustness and the quality of our outputs. And it's not just in economics, I guess this filters through into Parliament and governments as well. Betsy Stevenson's analysis, we were really privileged to have Betsy Stevenson talk at a gender economics workshop last year. And if you're interested in that and you've got a copy of the newsletter, there's a bit of a wrap-up article so you can see the graphs, which Andrew has talked about. There's also work by that's published in The Economist, which shows quite starkly, when they surveyed American economists, actually UK economists as well, that female economists, on average, have different views from male economists across a range of issues. And so you're going to arrive at different conclusions and different outcomes. And so we're sort of far from objective. We are actually bringing in life experience here. So I think what we might need to challenge is this notion that economics is a purely objective neoclassical market framework. And traditionally, if you challenge that, you're on the fringes, you're seen as a feminist economist. How do you bring it into the mainstream, and how is it better? Throw this question to you, or given your background, how do we navigate what is traditionally seen as feminist or marginalised interest and actually bring it into the crux of everyday issues?
Okay, so I've already laid on the table, I'm not an economist. I work in the area of tax and transfers, though, and that's one of those areas which is still fairly heavily male-dominated in terms of the academic literature and so on. So how do we challenge it? Well, I think we really have to ensure that alternative voices and alternative methodologies and the heterodox forms of economics are actually out there and being approached. I mean, some of the things that Iris referred to today, I think it was Iris or was it Shelley yesterday, were things like the number of male authors on papers and setting up teams which make sure that women are well represented. I'm very fortunate at Curtin. I'm working with a team of economists on a project, and we're all female. That's led by Siobhan Austin, and we're basically looking at intra-household stuff. But that's something that men would probably never think of doing. because what we're saying is you don't get a true picture of what's happening by looking at households. You've got to look inside the households. And that's going to give us so much information about resource sharing that will inform superannuation policy. It will inform things like there's a growing interest in the policy space in economic violence against women, or economic abuse, I should say, and it will help us to inform that sort of information. But you've got to really stick to it and be able to persuade reviewers and persuade your faculties that this is a project that is going to contribute. And I'm going to now use the latest academic buzzword of impact. If you can show that what you're doing is actually likely to have an impact in the policy space, then go out and do it and get support for it and make sure that people understand why it is you're doing what you're doing and make the case. And we need that data out there. We need those alternative methods of research and those alternative views expressed.
Yes, I have a bit of a suspicion that the current incentive system, the way that publications are rewarded, does not end up venturing into some of these new territories where the data might be a bit shaky, or there's not the perfect instrumental variable. You're not going to get published, you're going to get pushed out of that academic recognition, even though they're vitally important issues. Andrew, would you like to comment?
It's striking how often when papers are co-authored by men and women, not only within academia does the woman get less credit when you look at what it does for tenure decisions, but in the press, often the woman's role is downplayed. So my friend Justin Wolfe has had a lovely little New York Times column where he looked about some of the joint work done by Annese and Angus Deaton, where it would be reported as something like Angus Deaton and his wife Annese, who happens to be an economist. And he also gave the example of a letter that Ralph Nader wrote to Janet Yellen, arguing for an approach to monetary policy that took account of behavioural economics and suggested that she might want to speak to her husband, George Akerlof. And as Justin said, George would be the first one to admit that when it comes to monetary policy, Janet Yellen is the person within the household who really knows what's going on. So many of these little implicit biases are now, I think, being usefully surfaced. I'm sure you've spoken in the last couple of days about Alice Wu's paper looking at econ job rumours and the appalling list, which, for the sake of your ears, I won't read out, of most common words used to describe women on econ job rumours. That kind of language, I think, really does suggest we need to clean up economics, but also that some of what's going on in economics can teach us about improving the quality of the conversation within other professions as well.
You're interested in looking at unconscious bias and hidden biases, and you turned your interest to the economics profession. You would be killing two birds with one stone because you'd be producing good work, yes, but also helping to serve the interests of the advancing gender equality within the profession as well. Helen, you mentioned impact and the importance of impact. I'm just going to take that theme and move back to Trish. In your role at the Office for Women, what are some of the most pressing directions where you see a need for research to really be focused on that might be outside of your office's own capacity, which might be high on the agenda for the government and for the office? If you were to sort of have some ideas within the minds of this wonderfully talented group of economists here and guide them as to which areas to really focus on, and perhaps let's also navigate where the barriers might be if they want to go down that path to data constraints.
Thanks. I mean, that is a lovely invitation, and in terms of, we've always got our wish list that sort of we look at and think, my goodness. If you'd asked me this time last year, the nerd in me and everybody who knows me, all I could say was we needed a time use survey, and we have got that now. So I feel very happy about that, because that is just so critical to understanding how people spend their time in 2018, 2019 and into the future, and it is funded in an ongoing sense. So that was at the very top of my list, and a lot of people couldn't really quite understand why that was so exciting, but it is. That aside, so looking at some of the other sort of policy areas, one of the things that we were really keen in funding the Sex Discrimination Commissioner to do work on the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in the Workplace was to have also an economic study on the economic impact of this in the workplace. Because again, if we're trying to get a sense of, how does this impact business, not just socially, morally and emotionally for the individuals concerned, but what is the economic impact of this? And so I'm really pleased to say that work is well underway, and we should have some results later on. But turning again to some of the other gaps I think that we have, the economic abuse, I think as Helen rightly says, that I think that's a big area that is underreported, and we don't really have a strong sense of how that, what's the prevalence, incidence, impact, and so on. And I think that's another area that we really need to see the linkages between that and how it seems to be very much a co-indicator of physical domestic violence and so on. So it's I think more research into that sort of area. And then my wild card for you is really coming back to your comment about well-being and measuring well-being. I'd be really interested if anyone has looked at international data of some of the countries that have spent a lot of time and have quite a good, really comprehensive policy response to encouraging men to spend more time as parents, particularly within the first 12 months. I would love to know what's again the economic impact of that in terms of through looking at what does that do for family cohesion, rates of violence, and then impact on society. What are some of the broader impacts? Because I suspect there may well be some positive impacts from that, but I'd be really interested in that.
Just to that end, I will forward to your piece of work we did 2 years ago, about 18 months ago, called Engaging Men on Gender Equality, which outlined the benefits to men of having a more gender equal economy, a more gender equal workplace, and a more gender equal family life, whether that's with their domestic partner or with other people in their family. And our goal around doing that was to often when we talk about issues relating to gender, we're usually speaking to bunches of women who are already committed to the issue and want to see things changed. And so we were really trying to look at how do we make men care about this issue. And the obvious thing was, well, let's show how it affects them. And so we did a meta-analysis of global data to show how gender equality can improve men's lives by improving their own health and well-being, improving their relationships with other humans, including, especially if they're heterosexual men. You actually have, lower divorce rates if you're in a gender equal relationship as opposed to a traditional relationship. You actually have more satisfying intimate relations as well, which was a big win for men when we presented that data. And also, what impact does it have on your mental health and well-being? And what does it mean for a man to be part of a gender equal coupling with a woman? And what it usually means is that there are two incomes coming into the family, which reduces financial stress. It enables men to be more active in caring, which then diversifies their masculine identity, helps them build a relationship with. It's just win-win. There was no downside to it other than for people who really wanted to maintain the status quo because they just weren't interested in seeing a world beyond the current status quo. So I'll share that with you.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think it's really important to also focus on obviously men as well and call out for them because we don't have a gender equitable arrangement in place. I'm glad that you took the microphone, Lisa, because I'd like for you to continue the same question I asked Trish. You already have a very broad-ranging research program at DCA. If you have a wish list of other projects that you would like to really focus on where you think the research needs to go, or you wish you had data on something and it's outside of your reach at the moment, do you have a wish list? We don't want to steal your ideas. We're just going to share.
No. I'll tell you, it's not so much a wish list for new research. My wish list is for research to become more sophisticated. There are a lot of groups who operate in the same gender space as what we do, but they take quite a broad spectrum lens to women and don't take into account the intersection of women with other identities, cultural diversity, Indigenous women, socioeconomic backgrounds, women with disabilities, and also I love the work that gets done by groups like Chief Executive Women and Male Champions of Change. However, looking at boardrooms and executive positions is not the only thing we need to look at when it comes to gender equality. That elitist view is important, but it's not the whole picture. And most women can't even begin to aspire, or men. Most men are excluded from that elite group as well. And so I think whilst it has its place because we need to engage with power and people in leadership, we also need to focus at other things that are happening at the grassroots. Women who are locked out of employment. What happens when English isn't your first language and you're trying to get into the labour market? What happens when your cultural identity or your religious identity might mean that your interpretation of violence or your role within a family is different to somebody else? And also, what's the impact of the socioeconomic world that you have grown up in and the level of privilege that you have, and how does that play out? For me, that's my ongoing frustration with groups who want to do the best by women but look at women as one homogenous group. I'll just close with one thing. We've done work that shows the affirmative action programs that have been conducted by lots of organisations, well-meaning organisations, have benefited women of Anglo-Celtic heritage, and programs that focus on cultural diversity have benefited men of culturally diverse backgrounds. And there is a double bind of the culturally diverse woman or the woman with disability or the Indigenous woman that falls beneath the cracks. And I'd like a lens shone on that, so that's my wish list.
Fantastic. There's multiple layers of identity that matter. And look, in economics terms, we always want to differentiate between averaged effects and distribution effects and heterogeneity of populations. So technical word is saying variety and difference and diversity within the group that you're focusing on. So that's some really good leads there. Thank you.
Well, you did promise the audience at the start that I would at some point spruik randomised trials, so I thought I should put in a pitch for audit discrimination studies, which send out fake CVs and measure a bias, or else send actors into different situations, approaches to various groups based on to see whether or not male and female actors are treated differently, and randomised trials testing implicit bias, which some of the nudge units around the world have been experimenting with. I think there's an awful lot we can learn both about the problem and solutions through a randomised approach.
Absolutely. I think wherever possible, randomised controlled trials. Although this does bring us to another issue, ethical considerations. We're looking at domestic violence intervention or promotion, treatment. That's golden standard, randomised controlled trials, next best. Sometimes there's a hurdle in terms of how do we clear the realities of ethical consideration. What's your advice on navigating those types of scenarios?
So the most famous experiment, Leonora, which goes directly to your point, is the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, in which researchers are not sure what the best approach is when police get a call to a house where there's an allegation of domestic violence. So they give their officers pads, 3 bits of paper, or three approaches randomised through the pads. They either counsel the offender, they take them down to the station, then let them return to the house, or they lock them up overnight. And then they look at subsequent incidents of violence, including whether the victim was ultimately murdered during the course of the year. Massive impacts. Turns out locking up the guy overnight has a huge impact on reducing subsequent incidents of violence, and that approach is picked up by more than half US police forces within a couple of years. So it has a seismic change in outcomes. It did have to go through ethics clearance, and it got through ethics clearance on the basis that it wasn't clear at the outset which of these approaches would be better. But if they can do that, then I think we can be open to the idea that it is possible to explore other issues. I do know one major Australian survey that for quite a while, and I think perhaps still, refused to include questions about sexual harassment in the workplace on the grounds that it wasn't clear that the interviewer had the skills to provide counselling to somebody who had experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. I can understand that critique from an ethical standpoint, but I also think it's risky if we don't have good data on the extent of workplace sexual harassment, especially as many people do argue this is a key contributor to the gender pay gap.
Thank you for giving us an example which gives us hope and I'm optimism that these things are possible. But another question I'd like to ask, which follows on nicely from this, is if economists are at risk of being too narrow in our own toolkit, and if we need to do more to talk more to sociologists and historians and political scientists and maybe even feminists. Do you think economics are, if we're working in the space of gender economics, are economists actually doing enough of that? Just sense I'll throw that over.
I have to say that I work in a completely cross-disciplinary area. Tax in itself is made up of accountants, lawyers and economists. And as I've broadened out into gender, I've also picked up some of the language of sociology. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert in sociology or an expert in economics, but I understand the language enough to be able to work with colleagues who are experts in those areas. And that has added a real richness and a depth to the sorts of work that I'm able to do. And I think that you get a very different type of output. The project that I mentioned earlier that I'm working on that's looking at households has a political scientist, myself, I'll say it's my legal background that brought me into this one, and economists. It's a mixed method study and we're getting some amazing information by doing that. And I think we've shared some of that with you, haven't we, Trish, with the Office for Women? And it's within a feminist action framework, and it's, yeah, we're getting some really interesting results. So watch out for that in the next year or so. Yeah.
Do you get a sense that we can learn from some other disciplines and some other fields?
Well, I'm always in favour of diversity. I mean, in the session before, for those of you who were there, I gave the example of the Apple Watch. For those of you who didn't hear it, when Apple released their watch in 2015, the health app on the watch was designed to help everyone be on top of health outcomes for themselves by monitoring every possible health response that their body had. And when they released it, they had neglected to include anything to do with the female reproductive cycle, menstrual cycle, menopause, pregnancy, etc. So essentially, because there were no female designers on the team, they designed a product that didn't include women, even though they had a global audience, so they left out half the human race. That's such an obvious example of why it's really important to have multidisciplinary individuals as well as a diverse group of people on any team when you're trying to solve a problem, because you will by default, and there's nothing wrong, we all have unconscious biases because it just doesn't occur to us to see something from an experience other than the one we've lived through. And And that there's nothing wrong with that, but that's why it's so important to try, if you're going to try and deliver a solution, to try and have as many different perspectives on the design team or the innovation team or whatever team it is. And so diversity of thought, diversity of identity, all of those things contribute to that. So I'm all in favour of cross-disciplinary approaches.
And it lets you just delve into other disciplines as well. So collaboration between economists and lawyers led to a paper in the US called Let Me Finish, which looked at the probability in US Supreme Court debates that a woman speaking would be interrupted. And the data crunching at that level is not a natural skill of lawyers. Lawyers tend to be more about sort of understanding the substance rather than crunching the numbers. So you bring in some economists who are able to write the large algorithms, and you end up with a paper which really sort of goes to a sociological question as to how discourse is conducted in the most powerful court in America.
Another field I'm thinking that we could grow upon more is like organisational management and how to handle change, how to implement change, what we actually call change management. Because regardless of what you're trying to do, you're trying to bring in affirmative action or gender equality initiatives or change the colour of the carpet, you need your people to feel involved, otherwise there can be resistance and scepticism. Is that sort of, can you learn from Parliament and government as to how to, how do you make change happen when you're up against the most stubborn and ideologically resistant people in some cases? I mean, that's a big question. Is it fair to throw that back to you, Andrew?
Tell me more about the question you're asking.
I'm thinking about, if you want to implement change, you sort of need to draw upon principles of change management and how to convince the skeptic and the resistors of how to make it happen and bring them on board. And I think this is alluded to this a bit in the past previously about making them realise that what they can gain from it. And you're in Parliament, you're in government, you're trying to make change happen on a day-to-day basis, and you're up against some of the most stubborn people. What tools do you use to actually negotiate and advocate for change that is in the interest of everybody?
Almost none in the Parliament and a lot in the wider community. So Parliament is the most masculine environment in which I've ever worked. Question time in particular is needlessly aggressive. The aim is to interrupt people and to throw them off their guard. And it's hard to think of another workplace in the country in which it's considered acceptable to shout insults at your co-workers while they're trying to do their job. Yeah. But you're
an economist?
Well, with economists, you're trying to help them, right? You're trying to, ultimately what you're trying to do is to identify the biggest problem in the paper and tell them how to fix it. And that's not what we're trying to do in question time a lot of the time. But certainly in the broader community, that coalition building skill is vital, and a whole lot of the change-making processes do depend on building significant coalitions. There's that lovely, perhaps apocryphal line about FDR when progressives would come to him in the White House and say, here's a great new progressive reform you need to implement. He'd say, that's great, I support you, now get out there and make me do it. By which he meant build the coalition which is sufficiently large in order to forge change. So we're very conscious of that on everything from the story of how the National Disability Insurance Scheme was built to how we win the public debate over ceasing to be the only country that provides refundable franking credits.
Yes, look, I think there's a lot, and this is where I think the sort of whole behavioural economics has so much to offer, because it really is looking at, it's accepting that beyond the bounds of rational economics lies irrational behaviour on occasions, and we don't all have perfect information. We don't all take account of the long term when we're having our donut for lunch or whatever it is in terms of our long-term health outcomes at the individual level. So I think there's an awful lot to be gained by looking at those sort of things, a social marketing approach. So really looking at, kind of what are the leadership aspects that you can employ to role model, to break down, kind of what are the benefits to different parts of society, and also working out how to work with those people who will always be the net losers, whether or not they're the losers because it's simply not the status quo, and if their power and influence is derived from the status quo, then they will be very strong in holding on to that. So how you actually work with them to see that there are benefits for them in a different way and a more general one.
Thank you. Lisa, you have a background in human resources. Is there something that economists can learn from that world?
I've got a sort of background in, I've got a finance background initially, and then I deviated off into HR. Look, yes, because anyone who studies organisational theory at university, if you've done an MBA or you do a degree in commerce, probably maybe even in economics, some of the subjects around that, you do learn change theory. And it's really interesting to me, and it's actually the basis of a new project that we're launching halfway through the year, where we've actually looked at all global change theory. We've looked at all the models that most of the major institutions on the planet have employed, and then we've applied diversity and inclusion to that lens. It's actually never been done before, which for me was just gobsmacking that people don't say, well, there's all this change theory that's evidence-based that is used whenever organisations are going through massive restructuring or they want to achieve something different. But then when it comes to social things we want to change or behaviours we want to change around gender equity, we don't use that theory, we don't do it through that lens. And so watch this space. We hope to be releasing that piece of work in the middle of the year.
There's been quite a few campaigns that have resulted in big policy change that have essentially started outside the parliamentary system, and that is, it's my understanding, this goes back to before I was part of NFAW, that the first moves for paid parental leave came from a coalition of academics and community people who started to lobby and negotiate and discuss it and caught the attention of the policymakers. And from there it went to the Productivity Commission, and then of course we now have a version of a paid parental leave scheme, which may not have been what was originally hoped for by the people who started this campaign. But it does show that sometimes an evidence-based grassroots campaign can work its way up through the system. But I would certainly not be looking at the Parliament as an example of change management. I'm still waiting for the Objectives of Superannuation Bill 2016 to actually emerge from the sausage-making machine.
And so we can't have this conversation about talking politics and this messy world that we're looking at in our Parliament at the moment, gender-wise. Obviously, Andrew, you're representing one side of politics that is less contaminated by this gender underrepresentation problem than the other side of politics. What's your take on how does Australia actually sort of navigate through this and sort of look bigger picture of what we want our parliament to look like and set up cultural change? And is that too big to ask? You know, what's required so that we just don't have this sort of regressive state of parliament and we can move on and actually look at proper economic policy rather than, what was the latest such a statement that was made?
Yeah, and it's so much about the composition of the party room, and for us, quotas were a huge deal. So I'm struck when I hear members of the government saying we couldn't possibly have quotas for women, and yet they would never dream of setting up a cabinet that didn't include anyone from New South Wales. They would never dream of not including the Nationals in the cabinet. So they've got state quotas, they've got quotas within the coalition, but they're eschewing gender quotas. And It is a debate we had 20 years ago when Labor put in our quotas, and initially 35, then 40%. That concern that you would suddenly have a whole lot of women who would not only be less talented than the men that were going into Parliament, but also would be branded by the notion that they'd been brought in by quotas and would therefore feel terribly embarrassed by it. And you just saw none of that. I mean, that cohort of women who comes in straight after the quota change includes Julia Gillard, Tanya Plibersek, Nicola Roxon. There's an extraordinarily impressive array of women. And it simply meant that all that had to happen was the party looked a little further to find candidates and ended up finding good ones. And I know, as I'm sure all of us do, talented Liberal women who would be at least the equal of their male counterparts in the party room. And I suspect, you know, as they're now sort of rocking back on their heels after comments like Kelly O'Dwyer's reference to homophobic anti-women climate change deniers, that the Liberal Party will be looking more towards a quota approach. It'll take them a while, but once they get there, I think they'll find it makes them a far more effective political force, and the country needs two strong major political parties. So I hope for the country's sake that happens.
Thank you. It harks back to a broader societal issue where women are held to a high standard of account and come under attack more often than men. I think it's been uttered at some stage through this workshop that a true indicator we will know that we're being successful in reaching gender equality when we have mediocre women just as much as we have mediocre men. So I don't know, I'd like to think more names. I'm not sure if that's the target of the Office of Women wants to adopt. So Trish, to return back to you, we're thinking about Parliament and power and how it's a sort of a case study for the portrait of women in society in general, and these hidden cultural forces where women aren't rewarded as much as men are doing the same thing or are penalised for. This might be outside of your immediate scope, but where do you see hope, or where do you think, where are the barriers we just really need to crack to get through this?
Well, I clearly can't comment on current Parliament or the government in any way in that sense, other than to say, you know, as a citizen, I look at Parliament and think it is not it's not providing the leadership in terms of culture and values and representation to the extent that we need it to. And I think, when I look at the issue of quotas or targets and things like that, certainly the government, has committed to targets around gender representation on government boards, and that's been remarkably successful. So I'll simply say, that's gone from, they had a target of reaching 40% in 2016 of women on government boards. That was surpassed, and they now have a target of 50%, and they're at 46.5%. So it clearly what gets focused on tends to bring results against that accountability loop and that public commitment, I think. So I'll just use that as an example of where I think it can work and leave it at that. Thanks.
I didn't need to ask for the immediate one, but the smaller societal picture. Helen, you've been in Parliament many years ago. Not many, but
many years.
So let's imagine that we do move into a world where women feel more comfortably invited into Parliament. What do you envision will be different? Because we had a really great paper presented here looking at French Parliament, and they showed how it shifted the topics that were discussed and what was legislated. There was more focus on health and children issues, less focus on military issues. So based on your experience in Australian Parliament, what do you think would be the windows of change?
Well, first I'll just make a couple of general comments, and one is that I was in the other place. I was in the upper house of the West Australian Parliament, and the culture there is a little more civil than it is in the lower house. generally. I believe that the current Senate has broken that mould because of the number of rather rambunctious independents and crossbenchers that you have there. But yeah, the standing orders and the conduct in the upper houses has in the past been a little more civil than it has been in the lower houses. The other comment I would make generally is that I was a representative of the Australian Democrats when they were actually a force, and it's my observation that it's easier for women to rise in the smaller parties than it is in the big ones. And a lot of that, I think, is because there isn't the same, at that time, there was not the same career path, whereas you would come out of university with a relevant degree, move into the parliamentary system through an advising role, and from there, hopefully, you would be at some time tapped on the shoulder for a safe seat. The minor parties don't have that, and I find it's quite interesting to see how successful independent women have been in some of the lower house seats, and I think that's to do with what they focus on and their style of campaigning. But to get back to that issue of what women focus on, I think it's fairly true to say that the areas that women will be active in are ones where they can see that it affects people's lives in a different way. I wasn't at all surprised to see that data about what is generally referred to as women's issues. That's a little bit of a problem in itself, but women's issues, children, education, health, as opposed to military at the other end. But one comment that I made at the time in that session is that quite often there are issues where the men would prefer to step back and allow and encourage the women to take the lead. And I was in the Western Australian Parliament at the time that we debated decriminalisation of abortion. And the men very much said that we want this to be something that the women managed, the women handled in both houses. The people who led the bills were the women, and men contributed to the debate, but it was very much respectful of the fact that we were talking, one of the cultural issues around that is whether we are ceding control of our bodies to men. And most of the men who were, how can I put this, because it is a conscience vote, the men who were more sympathetic to the issues around choice, pro-choice, they were the ones who basically said, we want the women to lead this. The men who were anti-choice were still very vocal in the debate. It's just, that's a function of culture, society. But as far as the parliamentary process goes, I think that there is a sense that when there are women there to take the lead on certain issues, then the men will step aside and let them take the lead on those issues.
I guess the question is, do the men not think they're serious issues? But
sometimes, I mean, I noticed that the paper yesterday dealt with amendments that were moved, and I can only put the Australians' context over the French data, which I'm not quite sure what their parliamentary processes are like. But I would say that sometimes there are things that women look at and say that's not going to work because it's going to affect women in a particular way, where women will move those sorts of amendments. And it may honestly be a case where nobody has actually looked at it from that perspective. And this is where diversity becomes so important, because you have multiple voices speaking about these things in different ways and identifying things and identifying potential solutions.
I just wanted to add, in terms of, we were mentioning there, do men want to focus more on the military? One of the really fascinating areas that the Office for Women has policy responsibility across government is in the area of women, peace and security. And we're in the process at the moment of developing the second National Action Plan around that. And that's based on extensive research that shows that women's involvement in particularly in negotiations over peace and so on, lead to, I haven't got the exact numbers, but it's far more successful, enduring negotiations as a result of having women involved in those negotiations, and in women in peacekeeping activities and design of peacekeeping and actual deployment of peacekeeping activities, again, have just far better outcomes. So we're actually leading that together. We lead that supported by Defence and Foreign Affairs and Trade, and it's a fascinating area. So I think it's actually really, really a positive thing.
I was simply trying to work out a sort of pithy statistic on how badly we've done in politics. It did occur to me we've had 3 times as many Prime Ministers called John as we have Prime Ministers called who are women.
There's some statistic about when Julia Gillard came to power, that she smashed some sort of record number of negotiation agreements.
Yeah, 500 bills through the Parliament, which did speak to Julia's ability to just engage so effectively with the crossbench. No one's held a candle to her before or since.
Efficiency, get the job done.
Yes.
And a lawyer. Lisa, I'd like to turn to you to draw for examples, and after this we will do one more question to the audience, more questions. But come back to the corporate board. What examples can you see of organisations which have been largely led by women, and there could be some selection going on here, but what do you see that's different about how they operate and their performance outcomes?
Well, unfortunately, there's not that many organisations that are led by women, and when they are led by women, often even if there's a female CEO or a representative number of women on the boards, the executive teams are still not gender-based. So it's probably not a massive pool of people to draw on, other than to say the more women that you get into leadership, the more balanced the gender mix is, the more you start to dismantle workplace cultures that are conducive. And this is obviously not a rule for everyone, because clearly women are just as capable of bullying behaviour as men. But the more you are able to infuse diverse voices into leadership, the more likely you are to create inclusive work environments where things like bullying are called out, where things like respect become more commonplace, because lots of groups of different types of people force people to be quite polite to one another. And one of the things we do know, especially about hypermasculine behaviour, is that, and a lot of sporting teams have used this in the past to build connection, is the idea of shared transgression and doing things as a group, as a bonding exercise. That's just simply not possible if you have groups of people who are not of all the same ilk. So I think the lesson to learn is when you have diverse groups of people in leadership, you tend to have more inclusive work environments, and we define inclusion at DCA measurably as organisations where people feel connected to other human beings, where they're respected, so they're working in workplaces without harassment or bullying, where they feel as though they can contribute and what they do matters, and where there's opportunity for progression and advancement. And the more you dismantle a dominant culture, and those dominant cultures are different across industries and across jurisdictions as well, the more likely you are to create workplaces where there's greater inclusion. And the benefits of inclusion, as measured by our Inclusion at Work Index, is that you get greater innovation, greater loyalty, increased productivity, increased engagement, lower absenteeism, lower presenteeism, and all-round more productivity. It's just so, but let me just say, it's not easy to do, because and we have this thing internally wired into us in our evolutionary brains, which means we look for patterns. And so if you're like me, I'm going to naturally be drawn to you and want to have a coffee with you. And that it's unnatural for us as human beings to want to hang out with people who are really, really different to us. So it's harder to do, and it's harder sometimes to build relationships. And it's also harder to force your aura to alter to the extent that you're open to difference, because it's just not a natural way of for us to be. And I've done enough work in this area to know that our modern urban workplaces haven't yet caught up with the way our societies are now structured and organised. And so therefore we have to deliberately try and do things that are a little bit different to try and create those inclusive teams. The other thing, just before I hand over, is that greater diversity will lead to probably more conflict, because you've got people thinking about things in a different way. Not everyone's going to agree. It's how you deal with that conflict that matters. So creating environments that are respectful, that enable people to have a contribution that might be different to the previous contribution, and doing that in a respectful way eventually leads to a better end result. But it takes work. It's unnatural, and unnatural in the sense that we're not wired to work with difference, but it's absolutely worth it.
And thank you for being so realistic about it and not giving a rose-coloured picture, because that's not helpful either. I think what you've alluded to also speaks to some of the concepts that we heard about this morning, like basically affinity bias and the dangers of groupthink, and how we need to cut through with design mechanisms to actually shake out those biases in everyday practices. Look, before throwing open to the audience for questions, we spoke about, Andrew, you mentioned you brought up Chris Bowen previously, has commented that Australia has had a female governor or some female in the economics portfolio. We had Chris Bowen at one of our recent web events a year or two ago in Melbourne, and he made a really poignant comment. He said, "It's no coincidence that we've never had a female leader of an economics ministerial portfolio in Australia, because that's where the true power lies." It's a very powerful statement in itself. I'm going to throw this question to everyone in the panel. Do you ever realistically envision a day when Australia will have a female treasurer, or a female RMIT governor, or a female chief economist, or a female chair of advocacy, or female chair of Productivity Commission, ABS, Australian Statistician, ATO, Commissioner of Taxation, all falling within Treasury economic portfolio? And as far as Wikipedia told me, I've never had a female in those roles.
Can I just say, I just have to correct the record. We have Kelly O'Dwyer became Minister for Women when she was the Assistant Minister for Revenue and Financial Services, and she also had a seat in Cabinet and the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet. First time, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for pointing that out.
We should probably throw in Penny Wong as Finance Minister as well.
Yes.
Finance Minister. Okay. So on that list. Okay. Yeah. So we do have some groundbreaking women, but we still have all these vacancies. So yes, thank you for highlighting this. Are we moving in that way, or are we aiming?
Of course we can do it. Yeah, of course. Yes, and hopefully sooner rather than later. I'm an optimist.
Me too. I'm absolutely convinced that I think there is such a groundswell of people with talent, women with talent, who I think will more and more aspire to those sorts of roles. And I think it's it's great to see the beautiful diversity of people that we've had across certainly today while I've been here, and I just hope that we see people continue to put themselves forward for leadership positions.
We just added Claire O'Neill and Madeline King to the economics team, both of whom are superstars. And I think the change can happen pretty rapidly. There's a terrific lecture that Lucy Ellis gave where she looked at the share of incoming RBA grads who were women, and they took, within a decade, they went from a third women to a half women, just through a little bit of careful analysis as to where implicit bias was causing them to overlook talented female applicants. Now, that'll take a little while before it translates into an RBA governor, but it does show strong awareness within the bank of the importance of making sure that they're tackling implicit bias.
I think there's two parts to this question. One is that, yes, I think within the public service, there's a lot more awareness, a lot more recruitment, a lot more removal of barriers internally, but there's still an issue where so many of these very, very senior appointments, and I'm thinking now particularly, excuse me, of the appointment of Chris Jordan as Commissioner of Taxation several years ago now, they are actually appointed from outside. So unless we also have very senior women outside at the levels where they come under attention for these sorts of roles, internally, yes, doing well, but there's the additional problem of the external appointments into those positions, which is a whole other can of worms around public sector management.
Supply chain's a bit complex.
Yeah.
Yes.
I must also mention that we were delighted to have Varan and also Kelly O'Dwyer at various of our women events. That was absolutely spectacular to have them come. So we're really privileged in that way. So thank you for raising their names again as well. Okay, so questions. Beck has a roaming mic. Just a show of hands. Who would like to ask a question?
Thank you. I didn't expect first question. Hi, I'm Alberto. I work at here at RMIT. My question basically is for Andrew, but it builds on a comment that Lisa made about for a lot of places when they gain diversity, they need sort of this baseline cultural change so that people from diverse backgrounds are clearly heard. You mentioned, Andrew, in Parliament that their Labour Party is thinking about, increasing quotas and really increasing women's participation in Parliament. I'm wondering, though, in the absence of cultural change, where they actively change this aggressive behavior that you spoke about, whether women's voices will actually be heard, or whether we'll just have a lot more diversity within Parliament, but the same old voices being heard over and over again. And if so, should the policy be coupled with active cultural change, and how hard is that in practice? Thank you.
I mean, women's voices are very strongly heard. I suppose I think of one of the most famous parliamentary speeches over recent years being Julia Gillard's misogyny speech. So the voices of Julia Gillard and Tanya Plibersek and the like are very well heard in Parliament, but it's not to say that we couldn't do better in changing the structures so that the discourse is less masculine. And I suspect that would be useful for introverted men as well as for women.
Hello, thank you so much for the presentation. It has been so inspiring and enlightening. I'm Maria Sandoval. I just wanted to add something to Leonora's question, and also I have a question of my own. And for this, I think I would like to envision, taking from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, not a day where we have one of these, one day when we have all of these be women, to have that equality. And my question comes back a bit to the women's budget statements and just the general gender lensing. From going in the Australian history of the women's budget statements, I noticed a change in the wording of the titles. In the 80s, it was very much about gender equality, and it was a very strong prerogative. Then later on, it changed to more choice for women, and I imagine like with ads from the 60s, now with two options. So it went from gender equality to more choice, and then it just became women's economic security. And now internationally, there is just the language of smart economics. So I feel like some of the gender equality and the moral prerogative of a fairer society is being lost in the language. And if this comes from the top, how much is this having an influence in sort of the backlash and the losses that we are seeing in general perception about gender equality in society?
question for you.
Okay, thank you for that. That's very much what happened over that time of the 90s. Now, my PhD was on the tax transfer system, and that period during the 90s when Howard came in, we saw a whole range of changes. And the problem is that the language of choice is used, but the effect of the choices that were being offered was in fact one that was retrograde. So it was encouraging more of the homemaker breadwinner model rather than the dual earner model. That's changed again a bit now in the language, but you're right. To go from the language of equality and equity and fairness through this choice, which was supposed to be one way of giving us fairness, and then to sort of start saying, well, now it's about... I mean, I think the economic security framework is an important one because that does allow us to argue all of these issues around care and work and all of those issues. They all come in under that banner of economic security. One of the other things that has happened along the way was with the Beijing Declaration about mainstreaming of gender budgets. And I'm in two minds about that because mainstreaming is good as long as you can keep the focus there. But if mainstreaming is used as an excuse to say we don't need to analyse things, then that's not a good move. And I think that that's a part of what happened in that period of the 90s into the 2000s. And that's why they became just women's statements, which basically said these are our specific initiatives. And the whole focus of where women stand in society was lost as part of that. But hopefully, under the changes that are happening now going forward, and depending on what happens over the next election and so on, maybe we'll start to see a little bit more of a rigorous analysis of what's the effect of policy overall is on men and women and other groups in society, other marginalised groups.
Sorry, I didn't formulate the question very properly, so I hope I can explain. So I think when Lisa said there is a problem also with this, not just gender representation, but also intersectional, Indigenous and immigrants. Are there any initiatives in Australian society or government that will give us hope for the future? How do we integrate girls, our daughters, from immigrants, from Indigenous societies to the,
Absolutely. In corporate Australia, absolutely, yes. There are lots of Australian organisations, even if they haven't come out publicly yet, but ones that I know of who are already who have set targets for cultural diversity in senior management or senior leadership. Now, given most of them are driven by commercial reasons, they might be operating in the Asia Pacific, and rather than looking around at their senior leadership team and saying, hey, Peter, we'll send you on how to say hello in 5 different languages and learn cultural practices, they realise, actually, we've got the talent coming in at the graduate level, we need to develop that. Yeah, there are quite a few organisations who are focused. A lot of them are focused internally on it and not making those targets public. With cultural diversity, the focus is on senior leadership. With Indigenous representation, as far as I'm aware, with a lot of our organisations that have got really active programs, it really is more about entry level. But we've got, we just had in the last couple of weeks 2 major Australian companies, BHP and Rio Tinto, come out in favour of constitutional recognition. Really, really, really bold that the members of the corporate sector, just as the corporate sector was really progressive around marriage equality, some of the work that we're doing at the moment to build a movement or a platform, and it's work we're doing with the Business Council on organisations that are going to support change in maybe the next Parliament of Australia around the recommendations from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And so there really is energy in the corporate sector around this. Not all organisations. If you really are interested in the intersection of gender and culture, I'd tell you to go to our website and download a piece of work called Cracking the Glass Cultural Ceiling, where that's what we looked at. That's what I was referring to when I said affirmative action programs don't benefit culturally diverse women. They benefit privileged Anglo-Celtic women, and they don't benefit others. And so we actually dug really deep and said, well, what can we do to crack the glass cultural ceiling? What are the issues, and how can organisations do better? And it's been a really, really popular piece of research by a lot of large Australian organisations. Look, it's still very early days. I mean, most organisations haven't resolved the issue for gender, let alone gender and culture through the one lens. But there is goodwill there, and there are workplaces that are trying to make things happen. So I've got confidence, even if it's slow. My view always is I don't mind so much if change is slow as long as it's irreversible.
Thank you. So we've talked quite a lot about research and how the research that we do might help to promote gender equality going forwards. But most of us in the room, I imagine, we teach as well. We're educators. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how we should be presenting economics in the classroom, and especially Econ 101, in order to make sure that we're having impact through our education as well as through our research.
Three thoughts. The first thing is make sure that we're doing plenty of micro and household decision making. So, you know, your standard rule of thumb is that undergraduate curriculums are a decade behind where the field is, and the high school curriculum is a generation behind where the research frontier is. And that means, you know, I don't find it that surprising that all of this fascinating research around family formation, around human capital decisions, isn't reflected in high school economics, which spends much too much time talking about the setting of monetary policy. Terrific if you want to go to the Reserve Bank, but not so useful if you want to think about how economics improves your life. The second is to be aware of the conversation within the classroom, and you know, I think one of the values of cold calling is gender equity, as that flows out, and making sure that there are opportunities to have as many women's voices heard in the room as men's. I'm pretty confident this is the only room I've been in this week where more women have spoken than men. And third is to be unafraid of pushing into controversial areas. So work around the gender pay gap it needs to be driven hard by the data. We need to be saying, for example, it doesn't look as though the gender pay gap is very big at all among low-paid occupations, and it looks as though it's, you know, it's like 5% among low-paid occupations and 27% among high-paid occupations. Even if that makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable, and to use the tools of economics to make students feel uncomfortable and therefore force them into being open to change.
I would just add too, we've been talking a lot to some of the women's alliances. Economic Security for Women is one that is pushing very much into that space of particularly focusing on women and girls' financial literacy and you know, bringing some of that economic thinking into a lot of their decisions. I know somebody who's a small business owner, and she laments the fact that every time a woman comes to her and says, one of her employees, and says, "Oh, I'm having a baby and I'll probably take, you know, 12 months off, maybe 2 years," and all this sort of thing. And she said, "Well, you know, have you done any real thinking about what that might do to your long-term income earning and economic security or independence?" And, you know, the person looks at her as if to say, "You mad? You know, this is not a financial decision." And she's saying, but there are financial implications. So the more we can encourage women in, you know, probably high school, well, all the way through, to really, really take responsibility for their own thinking about all their life decisions, I think is probably my biggest plea in this area.
comment on that question to Hayley, and give a plug to some of the initiatives that WEN has invested in. This morning I spoke about the student video and the Pathways in Economics Career Day, where amongst our WEN committee, we basically just brainstormed what were the images of economists that we wish we had heard about when we were younger that would have attracted us more securely into that into the profession, or we wish we knew more about earlier on. And we designed a panel where we had economists, some Alberta panel too, were the male, they were mainly female, so we were tilting the statistical picture, and they were talking about what motivated them to study economics, and they talked very personally, so they weren't talking about the Reserve Bank and monetary policy. They were talking about making a difference to people's lives and being able to alleviate poverty and deal with environmental issues and those issues that really resonate with younger people today, or which are just non-monetary, and which really busts the myth that economics is about money and profit. So we think that really connected to not just females, but perhaps a lot of other young males who are otherwise ostracised by this dominant image that economics is really quite hardcore and monetary oriented.